Have you ever wondered how someone could vanish so completely that even history itself forgot their name? Tonight, we're going to uncover one of the most remarkable stories ever buried beneath the red clay of the American South. A woman whose intelligence terrified plantation owners across 3 states. A healer whose hands could save a life or, as some would later whisper, take one. She built something in the shadows that no one saw coming. A network so intricate, so perfectly designed, that by the time the authorities realized what was happening, over 200 souls had already slipped through their fingers like water through sand. But here's what keeps me up at night. What made me spend 3 years piecing together fragments from crumbling ledgers and faded letters. This woman, this architect of impossible escapes, she herself vanished. Completely. As if the very darkness she used to free others simply swallowed her whole. Some say she made it north, others swear she never left at all. And a few, well, they believe something far stranger happened in that swamp on the night everything changed. If you've ever felt a chill run down your spine while standing in an old southern forest, if you've ever sensed that some places remember things we've forgotten, then you already know why this story matters. This isn't just history. This is a ghost that refuses to stay buried. So if you're ready to walk with me through the fog of the past, if you want to see what happens when one woman decides that enough blood has been spilled, then stay right here. What I'm about to tell you will change how you think about resistance, about courage, and about what it really means to disappear. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story has layers that will haunt your dreams for weeks. The plantation house still stands, though barely. 3 walls remain upright near the banks of the Congaree River in South Carolina, their brick faces scarred by fire damage that happened 173 years ago. Kudzu has claimed the eastern wing entirely, wrapping it in a green embrace that feels less like nature reclaiming space and more like the earth itself trying to hide something shameful. Local children avoid this place. They say the air tastes different here, metallic, like old pennies left in the rain. Walk closer and you'll notice the foundation stones are cracked in patterns that don't make sense, as if tremendous heat radiated from the inside out. The original fireplace, imported Italian marble that would have cost more than most workers earned in a lifetime, has turned the color of ash and bone. But it's the ground behind the ruins that tells the real story. Nothing grows there. Not one blade of grass, not a single weed, nothing for 60 feet in any direction from where the slave quarters once stood. Soil scientists tested the earth in 1987. They found trace elements they couldn't explain, compounds that shouldn't exist in that part of the state, residue from something that burned at temperatures far higher than a simple cabin fire. This was Thornwood Plantation, 6,000 acres of cotton and suffering owned by the Ashworth family for 4 generations. At its peak in 1851, 312 enslaved people worked these fields. By the spring of 1852, Thornwood had become something else entirely, a symbol that spread terror through every wealthy household from Charleston to Savannah. Not because of what the owners did to the enslaved, because of what one enslaved woman did to them. Her name, according to the single surviving document that mentions her directly, was Mercy. Though the letter that contains this reference, written by a terrified overseer to his brother in Virginia, suggests that even this name was given to her by the enslaved community with bitter irony. They call her Mercy, the overseer wrote, but she shows none. The Ashworth family had owned this land since 1743, when Edmund Ashworth received a royal grant from the colonial governor of South Carolina. 3 generations of Ashworths had lived and died in the big house, each one expanding the holdings, adding more acres, purchasing more human beings to work the soil. By the time our story begins in 1849, the family patriarch was Colonel Hector Ashworth, a man whose reputation extended throughout the Low Country. He had served in the state militia, sat in the legislature for 2 terms, and contributed generously to the Episcopal Church in Charleston. His neighbors considered him a pillar of the community, a gentleman of the old school who maintained proper standards of conduct and hospitality. What those neighbors didn't see, what no visitor to the gracious parlors of Thornwood ever witnessed, was what happened in the quarters after dark. What the overseers did with the colonel's silent approval. What the colonel himself did when he walked down the path to the small cabin at the end of the second row, the one where they kept the youngest women. Mercy had watched. For 17 years, since she first became old enough to understand what she was seeing, she had watched and remembered every face, every crime, every tear that fell in the darkness. And somewhere deep inside her, in a place that no amount of brutality could reach, she had begun to plan. If you want to accompany more cases like this, investigations that shake the foundations of what we think we know about the past, subscribe to this channel. You won't want to miss what comes next. Picture 6,000 acres of flat, humid coastal plain, broken only by the dark line of cypress swamps along the river's edge. The congaree moves slow through this territory, brown and heavy with silt, marking the western boundary of what the Ashworths called their kingdom. Cotton stretched from the main house to the horizon in every other direction, a sea of white bowls during harvest season that required every hand, every back, every drop of human energy the plantation could extract. The big house sat on a small rise, barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. Just enough elevation to keep the family above the worst of the summer floods. 16 rooms. Imported French wallpaper. A piano that had been carried by ship from Boston and then by wagon for 40 miles inland. The Ashworths entertained regularly, hosting dinners where guests marveled at the silver service and the endless parade of dishes emerging from the kitchen house. They congratulated themselves on their refinement, their civilization, while less than 300 yards away, human beings slept on dirt floors in cabins built for storage, not habitation. The slave quarters formed 2 rows running perpendicular to the main house, 28 structures in all, each measuring roughly 12 feet by 14 feet. These dimensions matter. They were calculated precisely, providing just enough space to prevent the spread of disease during the valuable working months, while minimizing any sense of privacy or personal space that might allow the enslaved to feel like something other than property. The cabins had no windows. Ventilation came through gaps in the walls that let in winter cold and summer mosquitoes with equal indifference. A single door faced the central pathway, positioned so that overseers walking between the rows could see into every dwelling at any moment. The workday began before dawn with the sound of a bell mounted near the overseer's house. This bell, cast in Pennsylvania from iron that had been smelted perhaps by free laborers, rang every morning at 4:30 from March through October. The enslaved would emerge into darkness, form lines, receive their assignments for the day. From this moment until the bell rang again after sunset, they belonged entirely to the work. Cotton cultivation demanded constant attention, plowing in early spring, planting in late spring, thinning the young plants, chopping weeds throughout the summer, then the endless labor of picking once the bolls opened in autumn. Thornwood used the task system, common in the Carolina Low Country, which assigned each worker a specific quantity of cotton to pick each day. Failure to meet the quota brought punishment. Not the abstract threat of punishment, but its immediate and brutal reality, administered by an overseer named Josiah Crane, who had earned his position through a reputation for extracting maximum labor through minimum resistance. Crane carried a cowhide whip with a weighted tip, a design that left deeper scars than the standard bullwhip, and he used it with the casual frequency of a man swatting flies. The punishment post stood at the exact center of the slave quarters, equidistant from every cabin, so that no one could avoid seeing or hearing what happened there. The wood had been worn smooth by the bodies pressed against it, darkened by sweat and blood that had soaked into the grain over decades of use. Beside the post sat a wooden box containing salt, which was rubbed into fresh wounds to prevent infection and to amplify pain. The Ashworths considered this practical rather than cruel. A dead or disabled slave represented a significant financial loss. Salt kept the wounds from festering while sending a message about the consequences of inadequate production. Beyond the whip, Thornwood employed other methods of control. Iron collars with extending spikes that prevented the wearer from lying down or moving through dense vegetation, used on those suspected of planning escape. Thumb screws for interrogations. A wooden box barely large enough for a human body, called the coffin, where troublemakers spent days in complete darkness without food or water. And worst of all, the threat of sale, of being separated forever from children, parents, spouses, anyone you had ever loved, shipped to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana or the disease-ridden cotton fields of Mississippi, places from which almost no one returned. The enslaved at Thornwood lived within this system of terror, but they also created spaces of humanity within it. They sang songs in the fields that carried coded messages. They gathered in secret at night to worship in ways that the Ashworths never sanctioned. They maintained family connections across generations, remembering ancestors whose names the plantation records never bothered to record. And they passed information, constantly carefully about everything that happened in the big house, everything the overseers did, every weakness in the system that held them captive. This was the world into which Mercy was born, sometime around 1824. The plantation records list her only as girl property of H. Ashworth, valued at $200 at the time of her birth. Her mother appears in the same records as Sally house servant, skilled in sewing, a woman who had been purchased from a neighboring plantation when she was 14 years old. Sally had already buried 2 children by the time Mercy was born, both lost to fevers that swept through the quarters in the summer months. She had learned, as so many mothers in her position had learned, to love fiercely while preparing for loss. But Mercy would not be lost. Sally made certain of that. From the moment her daughter could walk, Sally began teaching her everything she knew, not just sewing, but reading, numbers, the names of plants and their uses, the geography of the land around them, the patterns of the overseers' movements, the habits of the Ashworth family. Sally had a gift for observation, honed through years of service in the big house where invisible servants were expected to see nothing and forget everything. She passed this gift to her daughter, and Mercy proved an eager student. By the time Mercy was 10 years old, she had memorized every path through the swamp that bordered the plantation. By 12, she could identify over 40 plants with medicinal properties and knew how to prepare poultices, teas, and tonics that eased pain and fought infection. By 15, she had learned to read well enough to decipher the newspapers that the Ashworths left scattered around the house, gleaning information about the wider world that most enslaved people never had access to. And by 17, the year her mother died of consumption in a damp cabin without a single visit from the doctor who lived less than a mile away, Mercy had learned something else entirely. She had learned to hate. They called her to the big house for the first time when she was 19 years old. Miss Catherine Ashworth, the colonel's wife, had developed a persistent cough that the local physician couldn't seem to cure. Someone, probably one of the house servants who had heard rumors about Sally's daughter, mentioned that there was a girl in the quarters who knew things about medicine. Desperate for relief, Miss Catherine agreed to try whatever remedy this slave might offer. Mercy walked into the Ashworth parlor on a Tuesday afternoon in October 1843, carrying a small bundle of dried herbs and a clay pot of honey mixed with onion juice and wild cherry bark. She kept her eyes down, her movements small and unthreatening, presenting herself exactly as the white woman expected to see her, simple, harmless, perhaps a bit primitive in her folk remedies, but certainly no danger. Inside, Mercy's mind was racing, cataloging every detail of the room, the layout of the furniture, the positions of the doors and windows, the titles of the books on the shelf, the small pistol the colonel kept in his desk drawer that he thought no one knew about. The remedy worked. Within 3 days, Miss Catherine's cough had subsided. Within 2 weeks, she was breathing freely for the first time in months. Mercy found herself summoned to the big house regularly after that, first to treat minor ailments among the family, then to attend to the more serious injuries and illnesses that occurred in the quarters. The Ashworths discovered that their slave healers saved them money, reducing the need to call the expensive physician from town for every case of fever or infection. They didn't think about why Mercy's medicines worked so well. They didn't wonder where she had learned such things. They simply used her, as they used everyone who belonged to them. What the Ashworths never understood was that each visit to the big house gave Mercy information. She learned which doors were locked and which were left open. She discovered where the family kept their valuables, their documents, their weapons. She overheard conversations about business affairs, about neighboring plantations, about the movements of the slave patrols that rode through the county at night. And she began to understand something that would prove crucial in the years to come. The white people around her were not nearly as intelligent or observant as they believed themselves to be. In the quarters, Mercy's status rose steadily. She became the person people turned to when a child burned with fever, when a mother struggled in childbirth, when an old man's joints swelled with pain that made work impossible. She moved through the cabins at all hours, her presence accepted even expected in every corner of the slave community. The overseers let her pass without challenge because she was valuable, because losing her to a whipping injury or the rigors of field work would mean losing the free medical care she provided to the plantation's human property. This freedom of movement, invisible to those who granted it, became Mercy's greatest weapon. She began testing the boundaries carefully, taking slightly longer routes between cabins, pausing at the edge of the swamp to gather herbs that could only be found in the deeper woods, occasionally venturing beyond the official boundaries of the plantation when her work required ingredients that didn't grow in the cultivated areas. Each time she mapped the terrain in her mind, noting the paths that dogs would have trouble following, the streams that could hide a scent, the dense thickets where a person could disappear for hours without being found. By 1847, Mercy had established relationships with enslaved people on 4 neighboring plantations. She traveled to treat the sick, carrying passes signed by the Ashworths that allowed her to move freely within a 20-mile radius. No one questioned why a slave healer might need to visit other plantations regularly. Medicine was her cover, and she used it perfectly. What she was actually doing during those visits was building something unprecedented, a network of contacts, safe houses, escape routes, and signals that would eventually span from the Carolina Lowcountry to the free states of the North. She spoke to people who had attempted escape and failed, learning from their mistakes. She identified sympathetic free blacks and white abolitionists who might provide shelter. She memorized the schedules of the slave patrols, the locations of their stations, the names of the men who rode them and their particular habits and weaknesses. The network grew slowly, carefully, one trusted person at a time. Mercy never wrote anything down. She never spoke openly about her plans. She operated entirely through signals and codes that only the initiated understood, a system of communication so subtle that those who weren't part of it never noticed anything unusual, and she began to move people. One at first, a young man from a neighboring plantation who had been told he would be sold to Louisiana the following week. Then 2 more, a mother and her infant daughter, who faced the same fate. Then 5, then 7, then a steady stream of souls flowing north through routes that seemed to materialize out of the swamp mist and disappear just as quickly. The disappearances were noticed, of course. Plantation owners blamed each other, accused their overseers of negligence, hired additional patrols to watch the roads. But they never suspected the quiet healer who moved among them with her bundles of herbs and her downcast eyes. They never imagined that a slave woman could possess the intelligence, the organizational skill, the sheer audacity to build what Mercy was building. Leave in the comments. Never give up on the truth if you believe that justice must reach all the oppressed. The summer of 1849 brought a drought that withered the cotton plants and shortened tempers throughout the county. The Ashworths, facing a reduced harvest and the financial pressure that came with it, responded the way wealthy planters had always responded to economic stress. They pushed harder. The daily quotas increased. The punishments for failing to meet them grew more severe. Josiah Crane, the head overseer, seemed to take personal pleasure in the expanded scope of his authority. Mercy watched. She watched as a man named Thomas, who had worked the field since before she was born, collapsed from heat exhaustion and was whipped back to his feet. She watched as a pregnant woman named Dinah was forced to keep picking cotton until her water broke in the field, then punished for the delay her labor caused. She watched as children barely old enough to walk were put to work carrying water to the adult workers, their small bodies already being broken to the requirements of the system. Each atrocity fed something inside her, a cold fire that grew steadily larger as the summer wore on. She treated the wounds that Crane's whip left on backs too numerous to count. She prepared medicines to ease pain that never fully subsided. She held the hands of the dying and closed the eyes of the dead. And she remembered every face, every name, every single act of cruelty that passed through her field of vision. The colonel himself grew more erratic as the financial pressures mounted. He drank more heavily than usual, spending long hours in his study with a bottle of brandy and a ledger full of numbers that refused to improve. His visits to the quarters became more frequent, and the young women he summoned to the small cabin at the end of the second row began returning with marks that went beyond what even this brutal system normally produced. One girl, barely 15 years old, stopped speaking entirely after a night in that cabin. She never spoke again. Mercy treated her too. She cleaned the wounds, physical and otherwise, and sat with her through the long nights when sleep brought only nightmares. She watched the light fade from the girl's eyes, replaced by something hollow and empty, and she added another debt to the ledger she kept in her mind. The autumn brought no relief. The reduced harvest meant reduced rations for the enslaved, who had already been receiving barely enough to survive. Hunger became constant, a presence that sat beside every person in the quarters and whispered about the coming winter. Some of the older workers began to sicken, their bodies unable to recover from the summer's exertions without adequate food. Mercy did what she could with her herbs and remedies, but medicine cannot substitute for nutrition, and she lost 3 patients that November to simple starvation disguised as illness. The Ashworths, meanwhile, continued to eat well. Miss Catherine complained that the cook had become lazy, that the dishes weren't up to their usual standard, never once considering that the cook might be giving portions of her own meager rations to her hungry children. The colonel's son, a young man named Robert who had recently returned from university with ideas about modern agricultural methods, proposed selling off 20 of the older slaves to raise capital for improvements. He presented this plan at dinner as though discussing the sale of livestock, because to him, that was exactly what it was. Mercy heard about this plan through the network of communication that ran invisibly through every plantation household. She heard, too, that her own name had been mentioned in connection with the sale. Despite her value as a healer, the Ashworths had received an inquiry from a physician in Charleston who was interested in purchasing a slave with medical knowledge. The price offered was substantial enough to make the colonel consider the transaction. For the first time, Mercy faced the possibility that her carefully constructed network might be torn apart before it could accomplish its ultimate purpose. For the first time, she felt something beyond the cold rage that had sustained her through years of planning. She felt fear, but fear, in Mercy's hands, became fuel. If she was going to be sold, if her time at Thornwood was limited, then she needed to act faster than she had planned. She needed to accelerate the schedule, increase the risks, push the network to its limits before circumstances pushed her out of it entirely. The sale was scheduled for mid-January 1850. She had 8 weeks. In those 8 weeks, Mercy moved more people to freedom than she had in the previous 2 years combined. December 24th, 1849, Christmas Eve on the plantation. The Ashworths traditionally gave their slaves 3 days off for the holiday, a gesture of supposed generosity that cost them nothing, since no work could be accomplished anyway during the brief respite. The enslaved community used this time for their own celebrations, gathering to sing songs, share whatever extra food they had managed to acquire, and remember those who had been lost during the year. Mercy's mother had been dead for 6 years, but Mercy still felt her absence most acutely during the holidays. Sally had loved Christmas, had somehow managed to create moments of joy even within the confines of bondage. She had sewn small dolls for the children, cooked special dishes from recipes passed down from her own mother, told stories about ancestors who had lived free in Africa before the ships came. These memories haunted Mercy as she prepared for the evening's gathering. She had decided to attend the celebration despite the risk. Her plan required her to maintain her normal patterns of behavior, to avoid doing anything that might draw suspicion before the January sale forced her hand. She would smile, she would sing, she would pretend that everything was as it had always been. And then, in the darkness after the celebration ended, she would guide another group north, 3 young men who had been marked for sale to the Louisiana sugar fields. The celebration began at sunset in the largest of the cabins, a structure that had been cleared of its usual occupants to accommodate the crowd. Someone had acquired a bottle of whiskey, probably stolen from the big house, and it passed from hand to hand with careful reverence. The song started slow and mournful, spirituals that spoke of suffering and promised deliverance, but as the evening progressed, they became livelier, defiant in their joy, insistent that some spark of humanity could survive even this. Mercy stood near the back of the cabin, watching more than participating, her mind already moving through the logistics of the night's escape. She had positioned her supplies in a hollow tree near the swamp's edge. The 3 men knew the signal to look for, a certain pattern of knocks on their cabin door. The first stopping point was a root cellar on an abandoned farm 7 miles north. Everything was ready. She didn't see Josiah Crane until he was already inside the cabin. The overseer had been drinking heavily, his face flushed, and his movements unsteady. He had no legitimate reason to be in the quarters on Christmas Eve, no work-related excuse for interrupting the gathering. He had come because he wanted to, because his authority permitted him to go anywhere and do anything, because the sight of slaves enjoying themselves offended something in his twisted soul. What happened next would be disputed for years afterward, examined in court documents and newspaper accounts, analyzed by historians who tried to reconstruct the sequence of events from contradictory testimonies. What is certain is this: Crane grabbed a young woman named Ruth, who was standing near the door. Ruth was 18 years old, the daughter of a field hand named Abraham, who had been at Thornwood for over 40 years. She was also 3 months pregnant, a fact that only a few people in the quarters knew. Abraham moved without thinking. He stepped between his daughter and the overseer, placing his body in Crane's path. The old man said nothing threatening, made no aggressive gesture. He simply stood there, a father protecting his child, exercising the most basic human instinct in a place where human instincts were supposed to be suppressed. Crane shot him. The sound of the pistol in that enclosed space was deafening. Abraham fell without a sound, a red stain spreading across his chest. Ruth began to scream. Someone pulled her away from her father's body. Crane stood over Abraham with the smoking pistol still in his hand, looking almost surprised at what he had done, as if the alcohol had acted and his conscious mind was only now catching up. Mercy was kneeling beside Abraham before she fully registered that she had moved. Her hands found the wound, felt the blood pulsing out with each weakening heartbeat. She knew immediately that nothing could save him. The bullet had entered his chest at an angle that would have destroyed the major vessels near his heart. He had minutes, perhaps less. Abraham's eyes found hers. He couldn't speak, but his expression communicated everything that words could not. Mercy held his gaze as the light faded from it, held his hand as the pulse beneath her fingers stuttered and stopped. She closed his eyes gently, the way she had closed so many eyes before. But this time was different. This time, something inside her that had been building for 25 years finally crystallized into perfect, absolute clarity. She looked up at Crane, still standing over them with the pistol. Their eyes met. In that moment, something passed between them that the overseer was too drunk to understand but would remember later, in his final moments. Mercy made no threat. She spoke no words. She simply looked at him, and Crane felt, for the first time in his violent life, the cold touch of his own mortality. Then she looked away and began preparing Abraham's body for burial. The killing of Abraham was never investigated. Crane claimed self-defense, said the old man had attacked him with a knife, and the colonel accepted this explanation without question. An enslaved man's life had no value in the eyes of the law, and the Christmas holiday meant that even the pretense of an inquiry could be postponed indefinitely. Abraham was buried in the slave cemetery 3 days later, his grave marked by a wooden cross that would rot away within a decade. Ruth gave birth to her child 4 months later, a girl she named Hope, in bitter defiance of everything around her. She never recovered from watching her father die. The light that had once animated her features dimmed to something mechanical, and she moved through her days like a person walking in a dream from which she couldn't wake. Mercy watched her too. She watched all of them, the victims and the perpetrators, cataloging faces and crimes with the precision of a clerk keeping accounts. The Ashworth family, Josiah Crane, the lesser overseers who followed Crane's example. The white neighbors who benefited from the system, even if they didn't directly participate in its worst excesses. Each face became an entry in the ledger of debt that Mercy intended to collect. Colonel Hector Ashworth, 63 years old, patriarch of Thornwood, served in the state legislature, respected throughout the county. His crimes were legion but hidden behind the facade of gentility. The young women summoned to the cabin, the casual brutality toward those he considered his property, the deliberate starvation of the quarters during lean times while his own table remained abundantly supplied. He had sired at least 4 children by enslaved women, children he refused to acknowledge and sometimes sold away when their presence became inconvenient. Miss Catherine Ashworth, 57, wife of the colonel, mistress of the household. She presented herself as a pious Christian woman, attended church every Sunday, contributed to charitable causes that aided poor white families in the county. She never personally struck an enslaved person, considering such violence beneath her station. Instead, she achieved her cruelty through indirection, through punishments assigned for infractions so minor that they could not be avoided, through the constant psychological pressure of impossible standards and inevitable failure. The house servants feared her far more than they feared her husband. Robert Ashworth, 24, only surviving son, recently returned from the College of Charleston with modern ideas about plantation management. He saw the enslaved as economic units to be optimized, not as human beings to be tortured. This made him more efficient in his cruelty rather than less. He calculated the exact amount of food that would sustain a worker without wasting resources on comfort. He designed work schedules that extracted maximum labor while minimizing injury-related losses. He proposed breeding programs to increase the plantation's human stock, selecting parents based on physical characteristics the way a farmer might breed cattle. Josiah Crane, 41, head overseer, murderer of Abraham. Born poor white in the Georgia backcountry, he had worked his way up through positions on successively larger plantations, earning his reputation through brutality that even other overseers found excessive. He took pleasure in pain, in the power his position gave him over people who could not fight back. The whip in his hand was not merely a tool of discipline, but an extension of his twisted self. He visited the quarters at night for purposes that had nothing to do with plantation security. Below Crane were 3 subordinate overseers, each with their own specialties of cruelty. One focused on the field workers, driving them with a relentlessness that ignored illness, injury, or exhaustion. Another supervised the mechanics and craftsmen, finding fault with every piece of work and punishing accordingly. The third managed the domestic staff in the big house, reporting every real or imagined infraction to Miss Catherine for judgment. Beyond the plantation itself, Mercy's awareness extended to the broader apparatus of oppression that sustained slavery in South Carolina. The slave patrols that rode the roads at night, armed white men with legal authority to stop, question, and punish any black person found outside without proper papers. The county sheriff, who received a fee for every escaped slave he captured and returned. The judges who enforced laws designed to make freedom impossible. The merchants who sold the chains, the whips, the iron collars. The banks that financed the purchase of human beings. The churches that preached obedience to slaves while assuring masters of their moral righteousness. All of them, every single one, had contributed to the world that allowed Abraham to be shot dead on Christmas Eve without consequence. All of them bore some share of the debt that Mercy intended to collect. But the catalyst, the event that transformed her long-burning rage into immediate action, came from an unexpected source. In late March 1850, a traveling abolitionist passed through the region. He was quickly arrested and charged with inciting insurrection, a capital offense in South Carolina. His trial was brief, his conviction certain. But before he was hanged, he managed to deliver a message to the enslaved community through channels that the authorities never discovered. The message was simple. The federal government had passed a new law, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required citizens of free states to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. The network of safe houses and sympathetic helpers that Mercy had spent years building suddenly faced legal penalties for their participation. The routes north had become more dangerous. And worse, slaves who had already reached freedom were now being hunted and returned to bondage. Mercy understood immediately what this meant. Her careful, patient approach was no longer viable. If she continued moving people north 1 or 2 at a time, the new law would eventually catch up with them. The network would be exposed and destroyed. Everything she had built would count for nothing. She needed a different plan. Something bigger. Something that would move so many people so quickly that the authorities wouldn't be able to respond effectively. Something that would strike at the heart of the system itself. She began to plan what would become known, in whispered conversations and terrified letters, as the Thornwood Method. The summer of 1850 brought another drought, worse than the one the year before. The cotton wilted in the fields, and the Ashworths, already stressed by the previous year's poor harvest, grew increasingly desperate. Robert's plans for modernization were shelved as the family struggled simply to survive. The threat of selling slaves, including Mercy, was revisited multiple times as the colonel searched for ways to raise capital. Mercy used the chaos to her advantage. She moved through the plantation with increased frequency, ostensibly gathering herbs to treat the heat-related illnesses that were striking down workers at an alarming rate. In reality, she was finalizing her preparations, making contacts, securing supplies, choosing the participants in what would be her greatest and most dangerous operation. Then, in late August, something happened that changed everything. Ruth's baby, Hope, fell ill with a fever that Mercy's remedies couldn't break. The child was 6 months old, a bright-eyed girl who had somehow inherited her grandfather's gentle smile. Mercy tried everything she knew, every herb, every treatment, every technique her mother had taught her. Nothing worked. She went to the big house to request medicine from the doctor's supplies that the Ashworths kept for their own use. Miss Catherine refused. The medicine was expensive, she explained, and couldn't be wasted on a slave infant who would probably die anyway. These things happened. It was God's will. Hope died 3 days later, in her mother's arms, in the same cabin where Abraham had been shot 8 months before. Ruth did not cry. She had used up all her tears. She simply sat holding her daughter's body, staring at nothing, waiting for someone to take the child away and bury her next to her grandfather. Mercy found her there when the sun rose the next morning. She sat beside Ruth for a long time without speaking. There were no words adequate to the moment. Nothing she could say would repair what had been broken, but she could offer something else. She leaned close to Ruth's ear and whispered something that no one else heard. Ruth's eyes focused for the first time since her daughter had stopped breathing. She looked at Mercy with an expression that mixed grief with something else, something fierce and hungry. She nodded once. Mercy had her first recruit. The following weeks moved with a strange sense of inevitability. Mercy approached others, one by one, choosing carefully from among those who had suffered most, those whose grief had transmuted into something useful. She spoke to them in private moments, during her rounds as a healer, in the brief spaces between work and sleep when conversation could not be overheard. She told them what she was planning. She asked if they wanted to participate. Not everyone said yes. Some were too afraid, too broken, too resigned to the permanence of their bondage. Mercy accepted their refusals without judgment. Fear was rational. Hope was dangerous. She understood both. But enough said yes. Enough had reached the same point she had reached. The place where fear becomes irrelevant because the present is already intolerable, and the future promises nothing better. 23 people in the end. 23 souls who agreed to risk everything on a single night's desperate gamble. Mercy assigned each of them a role. Some would gather supplies. Others would create diversions. A few would handle the most dangerous tasks, the ones that required steady hands and absolute commitment. She drilled them in secret, during the stolen hours of the night, preparing them for every contingency she could imagine. The date she chose was December 24th, 1850, exactly 1 year after Abraham's murder. The anniversary seemed fitting. Mercy's plan combined elements of several successful escapes she had studied, modified to accommodate the larger scale of her operation and the specific geography of Thornwood Plantation. The key insight was timing. Most escape attempts failed because they were discovered before the fugitives could get far enough away to elude pursuit. Mercy planned to create enough confusion that pursuit would be delayed for hours, possibly days, giving her group time to reach the first safe houses and disperse into multiple parties traveling by different routes. The selection of participants was crucial. She needed people with specific skills, someone who could handle horses, someone familiar with the routes to the north, someone capable of leading a group through unfamiliar territory, someone who could fight if necessary. But she also needed something harder to quantify, a quality of determination that would sustain them through the inevitable hardships of the escape. She found what she needed among those the plantation had tried hardest to break. Ruth, who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. Samuel, a blacksmith whose wife had been sold away 5 years earlier and who had been waiting ever since for an opportunity to follow her north. Marcus, a young man of 20, who had been caught attempting to escape twice before and who bore the scars of his punishment on his back. Eliza, an older woman who served in the big house and who knew secrets about the Ashworth family that would prove useful, and a dozen others, each with their own reasons, their own wounds, their own fierce desire to be free. The supplies accumulated slowly, hidden in locations around the plantation that only Mercy knew about. Food that would travel well, dried meat, hardtack, corn cakes wrapped in cloth, water containers made from gourds, blankets against the December cold, and medicine, of course, everything Mercy could prepare or acquire for treating injuries and illnesses on the road. She also gathered other supplies, a set of lockpicks that Samuel had forged in the blacksmith shop, ostensibly for repairing broken padlocks, several lengths of rope, 3 knives hidden in the hollow tree near the swamp, and something else, something she had been preparing for months, something that would make the Thornwood method distinctive among all the escapes that had come before. The map of their route existed only in Mercy's mind. She had memorized every turning, every landmark, every potential hiding place between Thornwood and the Pennsylvania border. The first stage would take them through the swamp, following paths that dogs would have difficulty tracking. Then north along the Congaree River to its junction with the Broad River. Then overland to Charlotte, where a free black community would provide shelter and fresh directions. Then through the mountains to Virginia, the most dangerous stretch, where slave catchers were most active. Then across the Ohio River to freedom. The entire journey, if everything went according to plan, would take approximately 6 weeks. 6 weeks of walking through the winter, avoiding patrols, depending on strangers for food and shelter, risking capture and the horrors that would follow. 6 weeks of absolute commitment to a goal that might still prove impossible, despite all their preparation. Mercy gathered her conspirators together one final time, 3 nights before Christmas, in the deepest part of the swamp, where no patrol ever ventured. She looked at their faces in the dim moonlight, saw the fear and determination competing in their expressions, felt the weight of responsibility for what she was asking them to do. She told them the plan, not in detail, not the specific steps that would unfold on Christmas Eve, but the broad outline, the destination, the risks. She told them about the new fugitive slave law and what it would mean for their safety even after they reached the North. She told them that some of them might not survive the journey. She told them that turning back would become impossible after a certain point, that they would be committed regardless of what obstacles they encountered. Then she asked them, one final time, if they wanted to proceed. One by one, they said yes. Some spoke firmly, their voices steady. Others whispered, their words barely audible above the sounds of the swamp. A few simply nodded, unable to trust their voices. But all of them, every single one, chose to go forward. Mercy looked at Ruth, who stood beside her with the same empty expression she had worn since Hope's death. But behind the emptiness, Mercy could see something burning, a fire that matched her own. Ruth met her gaze and nodded, and in that moment, Mercy knew they were ready. The countdown began. Christmas Eve, 1850, arrived under a gray sky that promised rain before morning. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the enslaved workers moved through their limited holiday preparations with shoulders hunched against the cold. In the big house, the Ashworths entertained guests from neighboring plantations, their laughter occasionally carrying across the distance to the quarters where a very different kind of gathering was taking shape. Mercy spent the morning making her final preparations. She visited each of the conspirators in turn, delivering small packages of supplies and confirming that they understood their roles. Her rounds appeared completely normal, the healer checking on her patients, nothing suspicious to attract the attention of the overseers who moved lazily through the holiday routine. In the big house, the Christmas celebration followed its traditional pattern. A massive dinner in the afternoon, featuring ham, turkey, vegetables from the root cellar, and pies made from preserved fruit, wine from the colonel's cellar. Brandy afterward for the men, who retired to the study to discuss politics and business. The women gathered in the parlor to gossip about neighbors and complain about servants. Josiah Crane had been invited to eat with the family, a rare honor that reflected the colonel's appreciation for his service. The overseer sat awkwardly among his social betters, drinking more than he should, trying to participate in conversations that were beyond his education and experience. By sunset, he was visibly intoxicated, his words slurring together, his movements clumsy. He excused himself early, claiming a need to check on the quarters, though everyone knew he simply wanted more privacy for his drinking. This was exactly what Mercy had anticipated. As darkness fell, the enslaved community gathered in the large cabin for their own celebration, much as they had the year before. The same songs filled the air, the same whispered conversations, the same desperate grasping at joy in the midst of suffering. But this year, 23 people in that crowd knew that something different was about to happen. They sang and talked and laughed with the others, giving no sign of the tension coiled inside them, waiting for Mercy's signal. The signal came at midnight. Mercy had positioned herself near the door of the cabin, watching through the crack between the boards for movement in the overseer's house. She saw Crane's lamp go out. She waited another hour, until she was certain he had fallen into the deep sleep of the drunk. Then she slipped out of the cabin and moved through the darkness to the hollow tree where she had hidden her supplies. One by one, the conspirators followed. They gathered in the designated meeting place, at the edge of the swamp where the plantation's cleared land gave way to tangled underbrush. Mercy counted heads, confirmed that everyone was present, distributed the final supplies. Then she did something that none of them had expected. She led them not toward the swamp, toward the escape route they had rehearsed. She led them back toward the plantation buildings, toward the big house, toward the overseer's quarters. "Before we leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there is something we must do." They moved through the darkness like ghosts, 23 shadows flowing across the ground without a sound. Mercy had trained them well. Every step was deliberate, every movement controlled. The cold December air carried no warning of their approach. The first stop was the overseer's house. Crane slept alone in a small structure built specifically for his use, separated from the other white workers by the status of his position. The door was unlocked. In a world where violence flowed in only one direction, locks had seemed unnecessary. Marcus and Samuel entered first. Mercy had chosen them for this task because of what Crane had done to them personally. Marcus whipped nearly to death for his escape attempts. Samuel's wife sold on Crane's recommendation. They had earned the right to be present at this moment. Crane never woke up. The details of what happened in that small room were never recorded in any document that survived. The official report, written weeks later, mentioned only that the overseer had been found dead in his bed, apparently the victim of the fire that destroyed his quarters. The fire began shortly after they left. It spread quickly, consuming the dry wood of the structure in minutes. The flames lit up the December darkness, visible from the big house where the Ashworths and their guests were sleeping off the effects of their celebration. But the fire was just the beginning. While the overseer's house burned, another group of conspirators had moved to the stables. They freed every horse, driving the animals into the darkness with shouts and waving arms. Without horses, pursuit would be delayed by hours, possibly days. The nearest stable large enough to provide replacements was 12 miles away. A third group had gone to the smokehouse, where the plantation's supply of preserved meat was stored. They took what they could carry and scattered the rest, contaminating it with soil and waste so that it couldn't be used to provision the inevitable search parties. And a fourth group, led by Ruth, approached the big house itself. They didn't enter. Mercy had forbidden it, knowing that an attack on the Ashworth family would trigger a response that would endanger every black person in the county, enslaved or free. Instead, they delivered a message. Ruth placed the object on the front porch, in the exact center of the doorway where it couldn't be missed. It was a piece of paper, protected from the weather by a covering of waxed cloth. On the paper, written in Mercy's careful hand, were 23 names. The names of every person who was leaving that night. And below the names a single sentence: "We are not your property." The groups reconvened at the edge of the swamp as the sky behind them glowed orange with the spreading fire. Mercy counted heads one final time, confirmed that the supplies were distributed, checked that everyone understood the route for the first stage of their escape. Then she turned her back on Thornwood Plantation and led her people into the darkness. Behind them, the shouts of alarm were finally beginning. guests staggering out of the big house to see the overseer's quarters fully engulfed in flames. The colonel stumbling across the yard in his nightclothes, bellowing orders that no one could follow because the horses were gone and the overseers were either missing or dead. Miss Catherine standing on the porch, finding the piece of paper, reading the names, understanding at last what had happened. But by then, Mercy and her followers had already disappeared into the swamp. The paths she had memorized over years of herb gathering swallowed them whole, hiding their tracks, confusing their scent. The darkness that the enslaved had always feared became their protector, their ally, their deliverance. The Thornwood method had begun. They walked through the night and into the next day, stopping only when exhaustion made further progress impossible. The swamp gave way to denser forest as they moved north, following the contours of the land that Mercy had mapped in her mind. Cold rain began falling around dawn, miserable but useful because it would further obscure their trail. The first rest stop was a cave that Mercy had discovered years earlier, hidden behind a waterfall on a small tributary of the Congaree. The space was cramped for 23 people, but it provided shelter from the rain and concealment from any pursuers who might already be on their trail. They ate sparingly from their supplies and tried to sleep despite the discomfort and the fear. Mercy allowed them 4 hours. Then she woke them and they continued north. The pattern established itself over the following days. Walk through the night, hide during the day, eat what they could forage or what their supplies provided, trust Mercy to know the way. The cold intensified as they gained altitude, moving into the foothills of the mountains. Some of the older members of the group began to struggle with the pace. Mercy adjusted, slowing when necessary, rerouting when she saw weakness developing. On the 5th day, they reached the first safe house, a barn on an abandoned farm whose owner, a Quaker widow named Sarah Jenkins, had been helping fugitives for over 20 years. She provided hot food, dry clothes, and information about the situation behind them. The news was both expected and alarming. The escape from Thornwood had already become famous throughout the region. Papers in Charleston were calling it the largest mass flight in South Carolina history. The state militia had been mobilized. A reward of $500 had been posted for information leading to the capture of any of the escaped slaves. And Mercy's name, extracted through torture from enslaved people who remained behind, was now known to every slave catcher in the South. Sarah Jenkins looked at Mercy with an expression that combined admiration and fear. "You've started something," she said, "something that won't stop." Mercy nodded. She had known this would happen. The fire, the dead overseer, the message left on the Ashworth porch, these were not just practical measures to delay pursuit. They were announcements, declarations, signals to every enslaved person who heard the story that resistance was possible, that the system could be struck at its heart, that even the most powerful masters were vulnerable. The Thornwood method was meant to inspire imitation, and according to Sarah Jenkins, it already had. 2 other plantations in the Low Country had experienced similar escapes in the week following Christmas. The details differed, but the pattern was recognizable. Coordinated action, destruction of property, messages left for the owners. The word had spread through the invisible network of slave communication faster than any newspaper could have carried it. Mercy allowed herself, for a moment, to feel something like hope. Then she focused on the immediate task, getting her people to safety. They left Sarah Jenkins's barn at nightfall and continued north, splitting into smaller groups to reduce their visibility. Mercy led the largest contingent, including Ruth and the others most closely associated with the escape. She had arranged for each group to receive guidance to the next stopping point, a relay system that had taken years to establish, but was now functioning exactly as designed. The journey became harder as they entered Virginia. The patrols were more frequent here, the population more hostile, the distances between safe houses greater. They lost one man, Marcus, to a fever that developed from an injury sustained in the swamp. Mercy buried him in an unmarked grave on a hillside overlooking the Shenandoah Valley, speaking words over his body that no one else heard. But the others survived. One by one, group by group, they crossed the Ohio River into free territory. The final crossing happened on February 12, 1851, 49 days after leaving Thornwood. Mercy stood on the northern bank and watched as Ruth stepped off the boat, her feet touching free soil for the first time in her life. Ruth fell to her knees. She didn't cry, she had used up her tears long ago, but her body shook with something that went beyond words. Mercy knelt beside her and held her until the shaking stopped. 22 of the original 23 had made it. The Thornwood method had proven that mass escape was possible. The news traveled south faster than Mercy's group had traveled north. By February, reports of the Thornwood escape had reached every plantation in South Carolina, and the ripples were spreading outward through Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. The story grew in the telling, becoming legend before it had finished becoming history. Some versions claimed that the escapees had killed the entire Ashworth family, which was false. Others said that Mercy had used witchcraft to confuse the slave catchers, which was closer to the truth than those who spread it realized. Still others insisted that the whole thing had been organized by outside agitators, white abolitionists from the North who had infiltrated the plantation and manipulated the slaves into action. This last version was the one the authorities preferred, because it preserved the fiction that enslaved people were incapable of organizing their own liberation. The alternative, that a black woman had planned and executed a military-style operation that humiliated some of the most powerful families in the state, was too threatening to acknowledge. But the enslaved knew the truth. They passed it through the networks of communication that no white person ever fully understood. The songs that carried coded messages, the gatherings at church services and funerals, the whispered conversations in the fields and kitchens. They knew that one of their own had struck back, had drawn blood, had escaped with her people into the night and vanished beyond the reach of their captors. And they began to act. In March, 12 slaves escaped from a plantation near Augusta, Georgia, using methods clearly modeled on the Thornwood escape. They burned the cotton gin before leaving, a gesture that had no practical value but enormous symbolic significance. In April, a similar escape in Alabama left 2 overseers dead and 3 buildings destroyed. In May, June, July, the pattern repeated across the Deep South. Coordinated escapes, destruction of property, messages of defiance left behind. The authorities responded with increasing desperation. Slave patrols were expanded. Rewards for escaped slaves increased. New laws were passed restricting the movement of enslaved people, limiting their ability to gather, imposing harsher punishments for even minor infractions. The entire apparatus of control tightened, trying to squeeze out the space in which resistance could form. But the more the system tightened, the more it seemed to generate the resistance it was designed to prevent. Every whipping became an argument for escape. Every sale that separated families became a recruiting tool for the networks. Every atrocity committed in the name of discipline became evidence that the enslaved had nothing to lose and everything to gain. Official documents from the period reveal the extent of the panic. Letters between plantation owners described a pervasive sense of fear that had never existed before Thornwood. Military reports noted the inadequacy of existing forces to patrol the vast territories where enslaved labor was used. Newspaper editorials warned of a coming race war that would destroy the civilization of the South. In all of these documents, one name appeared again and again, surrounded by speculation and confusion and dread. Mercy, the woman who had started it all, the architect of chaos, the ghost who had vanished into the darkness and could not be found. Where was she? Some reports placed her in Canada, organizing new operations from beyond the reach of American law. Others claimed she had returned to the South, moving from plantation to plantation, spreading her methods to new followers. A few insisted she was dead, killed in the escape, or captured and executed in secret to avoid creating a martyr. The truth, as always, was stranger than any of the stories. The search for Mercy became the largest manhunt in American history to that date. The federal government, pressured by Southern politicians, deployed resources usually reserved for military operations. State militias coordinated across borders. Professional slave catchers, attracted by the enormous reward that had accumulated for her capture, scoured the North and the South alike. They found nothing. The people who had escaped with Mercy had dispersed across the free states and into Canada. Some settled in established black communities trying to build new lives. Others joined the abolition movement, speaking publicly about their experiences and recruiting for the cause. A few, like Ruth, simply disappeared into the vast anonymity of a nation in transition, their stories lost to history. When questioned, none of them could say where Mercy had gone after they reached free soil. She had been there, on the northern bank of the Ohio River, on the night of February 12th. She had spoken with each of them, given final instructions, bid them farewell. And then, sometime before dawn, she had vanished. Some said she had continued north, heading for Canada, where she would be beyond even the reach of the fugitive slave law. Others believed she had remained in the border states, coordinating the escapes that continued to occur despite the increased security. A few whispered that she had returned to the South, that she was even now working inside the system that had created her, preparing some final act of retribution. The authorities searched everywhere. They raided suspected safe houses in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York. They interrogated free blacks and white abolitionists alike, using methods that exceeded even the brutal norms of the time. They followed every lead, investigated every rumor, pursued every shadow that might be connected to the woman they were hunting. In late 1852, a slave catcher named Thomas Grayson claimed to have tracked Mercy to a small town in western Virginia. He gathered a posse and raided a house where she was supposedly hiding. They found nothing but an elderly black woman who had never heard of Thornwood Plantation or anyone named Mercy. 3 months later, Grayson himself was found dead on a lonely road outside Richmond. His throat had been cut with surgical precision, and a piece of paper had been pinned to his chest. The paper contained a single word: remember. Whether this was Mercy's work, no one ever determined. The killing remained officially unsolved. But the message was clear. The hunter had become the hunted. The search continued for another 2 years, consuming resources, producing reports that filled cabinets in Washington and Columbia and capitals throughout the South. And then, gradually, it began to wind down. Other crises demanded attention. The sectional conflict that would eventually become the Civil War was accelerating. The woman called Mercy, whoever and wherever she was, seemed to have achieved the impossible. She had escaped not only from slavery, but from history itself. The last official document mentioning her was dated March 1855. It was a letter from the governor of South Carolina to the Secretary of War, requesting additional federal support for the ongoing search. The request was denied. Other matters, the letter explained, required the government's attention. Mercy had won. The stories never stopped. Long after the official search ended, long after the Civil War transformed the society that had created her, people continued to speak of Mercy in tones that mixed reverence with fear. In the communities of formerly enslaved people who settled across the North and the West, her name became synonymous with resistance. Mothers told their children about the woman who had defied the masters, who had led her people out of bondage, who had vanished like smoke when the hunters came for her. The details varied with each telling, growing more elaborate, more mythical, more removed from the documented facts of her life. Some stories claimed she had magical powers, the ability to become invisible, to control the minds of her enemies, to pass through walls and locked doors. Others said she was still alive, impossibly old but undimmed, waiting for the moment when she would be needed again. A few insisted she had never been human at all, that she was a spirit of vengeance called into existence by the accumulated suffering of generations. On the former site of Thornwood Plantation, where the ruins still stand amid kudzu and silence, local people continued to avoid the area long after emancipation made such avoidance unnecessary. They said the place was haunted, that on certain nights, especially the nights around Christmas, you could hear voices in the darkness, singing songs that no one had sung in generations. They said that if you listened carefully, you could hear a woman's voice giving instructions, coordinating movements, preparing for escape. Scientists who studied the barren patch of earth behind the ruins could never explain why nothing grew there. Soil composition, drainage patterns, chemical residue. All the rational explanations failed to account for the perfect circle of dead ground that marked where the slave quarters had once stood. Some suggested the fire had been unusually hot, had changed the soil at a molecular level. Others proposed that something had been buried there, something that continued to poison the earth. No excavation ever found anything unusual. The academic debate about Mercy continued for decades. Historians argued about her real name, her origins, the extent of her organization, the methods she had used. Some questioned whether she had existed at all, suggesting that Mercy was a collective name for multiple resistance leaders whose activities had been combined into a single legend. Others pointed to the documentary evidence, sparse but real, that confirmed at least the outline of the story: the escape, the fire, the deaths, the mass flight northward. But the people who descended from those who had known her had no doubts. In churches and community gatherings throughout the African American world, Mercy remained a real presence, an ancestor whose spirit continued to inspire resistance against injustice in all its forms. Her image, imagined rather than documented, appeared in murals and paintings and quilts. Her name was given to daughters born in families that traced their lineage to the Thornwood survivors. And, perhaps most remarkably, her methods continued to inform resistance movements long after the specific circumstances that had produced them had passed into history. The elements of the Thornwood method, coordinated action, psychological impact, symbolic messaging, community solidarity, appeared again and again in struggles for civil rights, for labor rights, for human dignity in contexts that Mercy could never have imagined. If you watched until here, it's because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if Mercy's story touched your heart. Share so that Mercy's memory will never be forgotten. The final mystery remains unsolved. In 1890, an elderly black woman died in a small town in Ohio. She had lived there for nearly 40 years, working as a healer and midwife, respected by everyone who knew her but never speaking of her past. She had no living relatives, no documented history before arriving in town, no explanation for the scars that marked her body. Among her possessions, found after her death, was a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside the bundle was a piece of paper, yellowed with age, containing a list of 23 names. Most of the names had been crossed out, apparently as the people they represented had passed away over the decades. Only one name remained unmarked: Ruth. Ruth had died in Canada in 1887, 3 years before the mysterious woman in Ohio. She had spent her final decades as a teacher, educating children in the free black communities that had formed across the border. She never married, never had more children after Hope. But she had told her students stories about a woman who had led her out of darkness, who had shown her that freedom was possible, who had vanished into the night and never been seen again. The woman in Ohio was buried in the local cemetery under the name she had used for 40 years, Sarah Williams. Her grave marker, a simple stone, bore only her name and the years of her residence in town, 1851, 1890. But local tradition, passed down through generations, offers a different version. According to the oldest families in town, the woman they had known as Sarah Williams was sometimes seen walking in the woods at night, gathering herbs by moonlight, moving with a grace that seemed out of place in her aged body. And sometimes, when the night was very quiet and the moon was very bright, you could hear her singing the old songs, the songs that no one sang anymore except in memory. They say she's still there, in those woods, waiting. They say that as long as there is injustice in the world, her spirit will remain, ready to teach her methods to those who are willing to learn. They say that when the time is right, when the need is great enough, she will emerge from the darkness once more and lead her people to freedom. Whether any of this is true, no one can say. The documentary record ends with Sarah Williams's death in 1890. The rest is legend, myth, faith. But somewhere in the woods of Ohio, or South Carolina, or everywhere that people remember what one woman accomplished against impossible odds, Mercy lives on. Not as a historical figure, fixed and finite, but as an idea, a possibility, a fire that refuses to go out. And perhaps that's exactly how she wanted it.